The mahogany table stretched between us like a battlefield, its polished surface reflecting the amber light of the law office chandelier. My parents sat rigid in their leather chairs, my mother's pearls catching the light as she adjusted them with that nervous habit she'd developed since grandfather's death. My father's jaw was set in that familiar line of disappointment I'd known since childhood. The lawyer, Mr. Henderson, cleared his throat and opened the thick manila folder that held what remained of my grandfather's voice. "Before we begin with the primary bequests," Henderson said, his voice carrying the weight of 40 years in estate law, "I must read a preliminary statement from the deceased." My mother's hand found my father's arm. They exchanged that look, the one that had excluded me from family decisions for as long as I could remember. The same look they'd given me when I chose art school over business, when I married Sarah instead of the banker's daughter they'd selected, when I opened my small gallery instead of joining father's firm. "To my family gathered here," Henderson read, "know that every decision in this will was made with careful consideration of character, not blood alone." The words hung in the air like smoke. My father shifted in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. Outside, rain began to tap against the tall windows, each drop marking time in the silence that followed. "Now, to the primary estate," Henderson continued, turning the page with deliberate precision. "The family home at Maple Ridge, valued at $2.8 million along with all furnishings and grounds, I leave to my son Robert and daughter-in-law Margaret." My mother's breath caught, not in surprise but in satisfaction. She'd been expecting this. They both had. The house where I'd spent summers learning to paint in the sunroom, where grandfather had taught me to see light and shadow, where we'd talked for hours about art and life and dreams that seemed too big for small minds to understand. The investment portfolio, currently valued at $4.2 million, I also leave to Robert and Margaret to be managed as they see fit. My father nodded once, a sharp movement that spoke of vindication. This was what they'd worked for, what they'd positioned themselves for during grandfather's final years. While I'd been building my small life, they'd been building their case for inheritance. Henderson's eyes found mine across the table. There was something there, not pity, but a kind of professional curiosity, as if he were watching a play unfold and knew the next act would surprise everyone. "The remaining liquid assets, approximately $800,000, I leave to Robert and Margaret with one exception." My mother's fingers tightened on her purse strap. The exception? There was always an exception with grandfather. He'd been a man who understood the power of the unexpected, who'd built his fortune not just on smart investments but on reading people, on understanding what they truly valued. "To my grandson, David," Henderson continued, "I leave my personal effects, including my art collection, books, and the contents of my studio." Personal effects. The words tasted bitter. Grandfather's art collection was worth perhaps $50,000. Respectable, but nothing compared to the millions flowing to my parents. His books, his easel, his paints. Sentimental value wrapped in legal language. My father leaned back in his chair, the tension leaving his shoulders. "Well," he said, his voice carrying that tone of finality I remembered from childhood arguments, "I think that settles things quite clearly." My mother turned to me, and for a moment her expression almost softened. Almost. "David, you know your grandfather loved you. These things, they're more meaningful to you than money anyway, aren't they?" The condescension in her voice was like a familiar slap. They'd always done this, wrapped their dismissal of my choices in concern for my happiness, as if choosing passion over profit was a character flaw they had to manage. "You'll get nothing," my father said, the words coming out harder than perhaps he'd intended. "Nothing that matters anyway. But then, you never wanted what mattered to this family." The rain against the windows grew heavier, drumming a rhythm that seemed to match my heartbeat. Henderson was watching me, waiting for some response, some protest. But what was there to say? They were right, in their way. I'd never wanted their version of what mattered. I'd never fought for their approval or their money. I'd built my own small world, and if it wasn't enough for them, it had been enough for me. "Is that everything?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Henderson glanced down at the papers, then back up at me. "Actually," he said, "there's one more item. A sealed envelope to be opened only in the presence of all parties." He reached into the folder and withdrew a cream-colored envelope, thick and heavy, with my name written across it in grandfather's careful script. Below my name, in smaller letters, "To be read aloud." My parents exchanged another look, this one less certain than before. My mother's pearls caught the light again as she shifted in her chair. "Shall I proceed?" Henderson asked. The room fell silent except for the rain, and in that silence I could almost hear grandfather's voice, patient and knowing, the way it had been during those long summer afternoons when he'd taught me that the most important things were often hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. Henderson's fingers worked carefully along the envelope's edge, breaking the wax seal that bore my grandfather's initials. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind grandfather had always used for important correspondence. As Henderson unfolded it, I caught a glimpse of the familiar handwriting, bold strokes that had grown slightly shakier in recent years, but still carried the authority of a man who'd never doubted his own judgment. "My dear David," Henderson began, his voice taking on a different quality, as if he understood he was no longer reading legal documents but something far more personal. "If this letter is being read, then you have just heard your parents claim their inheritance and you have accepted what appeared to be a token gesture, with the grace I always knew you possessed." My mother's hand moved to her throat, fingers finding the pearls again. My father leaned forward slightly, the leather of his chair protesting. "You did not fight for money because you never understood that money was what they were fighting for. You thought, as I raised you to think, that love and respect could not be purchased. You were right, of course, but you were also naive about the lengths people will go to secure what they believe they deserve." The words settled over the room like dust motes in afternoon light. Outside, the rain had steadied into a persistent rhythm that seemed to underscore each sentence. Henderson paused, glancing up at my parents before continuing. "What your parents do not know, what I chose not to tell them during the careful dance of these final years, is that the art collection I left you is not merely sentimental. 3 pieces in particular were acquired not for their beauty, though they possess that in abundance, but for their provenance and value." My father's chair creaked as he shifted. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice tight. Henderson held up a hand, indicating he would continue reading rather than interpret. "The Monet sketch in my study, which your parents dismissed as a reproduction, is authentic. Purchased privately in 1987, documented and verified. Current estimated value, $1.2 million. The silence that followed was different from before, heavier, charged with the electricity of shifting power. My mother's face had gone pale, making her carefully applied makeup appear suddenly garish. "The small Picasso drawing in the hallway, which your father once called modern nonsense, is a preparatory sketch for Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. Value, approximately $800,000. My father stood abruptly, his chair rolling back against the wall. "That's impossible. We had those pieces appraised years ago." "Oh, and finally," Henderson continued, his voice steady despite the growing tension in the room, "the landscape hanging above the fireplace in the sunroom, the one where David and I spent so many afternoons discussing light and composition, is not by the unknown artist your mother assumed. It is an early work by Edward Hopper, painted in 1910, before his style became recognizable to casual observers. Value, $1.8 million. The numbers hung in the air like accusations. My mother had risen from her chair as well, her purse clutched against her chest like armor. "This can't be legal," she said, her voice higher than usual. "If those pieces are worth that much, they should be part of the estate proper." Henderson looked at her with the patience of a man who had seen this scene played out in various forms throughout his career. "Mrs. Morrison, the art collection was specifically bequeathed to your son. The will is quite clear on this point. But more than their monetary value," Henderson continued reading, "these pieces represent something your parents never understood about you, David. You saw them not as investments or status symbols, but as windows into human experience. You understood their true worth long before you knew their market value." I found myself thinking of those summer afternoons, the way grandfather would sit in his worn leather chair while I painted, offering gentle guidance about color and form. How he'd point to the Hopper landscape and talk about the loneliness that could exist even in beautiful places, the way light could transform the ordinary into something transcendent. Your parents spent these final years positioning themselves for an inheritance they believed was their due. They visited more frequently, called more often, made themselves indispensable in ways they thought I would notice and reward. What they failed to understand is that I was indeed watching how they treated you, how they dismissed your choices, how they made you feel small for choosing passion over profit. My father's face had taken on a mottled red color. "This is manipulation," he said. "Pure manipulation. I am not punishing them for wanting financial security." Henderson read on. "I am rewarding you for never asking for it, for building a life based on what you love rather than what you could gain, for treating my final years as an opportunity to spend time together rather than an investment in your future." The rain against the windows seemed louder now, or perhaps the room had grown quieter. My mother had sunk back into her chair, her carefully composed expression cracking around the edges. All those visits, all those careful conversations about grandfather's health and comfort, had they really been so transparent? The house and the liquid assets go to your parents because they need them in ways you do not. They have built their identities around accumulation and status. Without these things, they would be lost. You, my dear grandson, have already found yourself. Henderson folded the letter carefully, but I could see there was more. "There's a postscript," he said, looking directly at me. "David, when you leave this office today, you will be a wealthy man. But more importantly, you will be a man who earned his inheritance not through blood or manipulation, but through character. Use this gift to expand your gallery, to support other artists who choose passion over profit, to prove that beauty and truth are the most valuable currencies of all." The silence that followed felt eternal. Outside, the rain continued its steady percussion against the glass, but inside the room, time seemed suspended. My parents sat frozen in their chairs, the weight of grandfather's words settling over them like a shroud. My mother was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "We didn't know," she said, "about the paintings. We truly didn't know. But that wasn't really the point, was it? The point was that they hadn't cared to know. They'd seen what they expected to see, dismissed what didn't fit their understanding of value. Grandfather had been teaching them a lesson about perception, about the danger of assuming that worth could be measured only in obvious ways." Henderson cleared his throat gently. "There are some additional documents here," he said. "Authentication certificates, insurance appraisals, and instructions for proper handling and storage of the pieces." As he spread the papers across the mahogany table, I caught sight of official letterheads, museum stamps, the kind of documentation that transformed family heirlooms into recognized treasures. Each certificate was a small revelation, proof that grandfather had been planning this moment for years, carefully building a legacy that would speak louder than any words he could have said while living. The rain outside began to soften, transitioning from the harsh drumming of a storm to the gentle whisper of a passing shower. Through the tall windows, I could see the first hints of sunlight breaking through the clouds, casting long golden rectangles across the office floor. The authentication documents spread across the table told a story I was only beginning to understand. Each certificate bore dates spanning decades: the Monet acquired in 1987, the Picasso in 1994, the Hopper in 2001. Grandfather hadn't stumbled upon these treasures. He'd sought them out one by one, building not just a collection, but a carefully orchestrated lesson in the difference between seeing and truly understanding. My mother reached across the table, her fingers hovering over the Monet's provenance papers as if they might burn her. 1987, she whispered. "That was the year you graduated college, David. The year you told us you wanted to study art." The connection hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable. While my parents had been arguing with me about practical career choices, grandfather had been quietly investing in my future, purchasing pieces that would one day validate everything they'd dismissed. "He planned this," my father said, his voice hollow. "All of it. Every conversation, every visit, every time we—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence, but we all knew what he meant. Every time they'd positioned themselves as the responsible heirs, the ones who understood real value. Henderson gathered the certificates with practiced efficiency. "Mr. Morrison, David, these pieces will need to be properly insured and potentially relocated. The gallery space you currently lease may not have adequate security for works of this value." The practical implications were beginning to dawn on me. My small gallery, with its modest security system and basic climate control, was suddenly inadequate for housing millions of dollars in art. But more than that, my entire life was about to change in ways I couldn't yet comprehend. "There's something else," Henderson said, reaching into the folder once more. "A business proposal, drafted by your grandfather 6 months ago." He handed me a bound document, perhaps 20 pages thick, The cover page read, "The Morrison Foundation for Emerging Artists, a proposal for sustainable arts patronage." Below that, in grandfather's handwriting, "For David, who understands that art is not decoration, but necessity." I opened to the first page, scanning grandfather's familiar prose. He'd outlined a plan for transforming my gallery into something larger, a foundation that would provide grants to young artists, exhibition space for unconventional work, and educational programs for children whose schools had cut arts funding. The financial projections were detailed and realistic, showing how the sale of even one major piece could fund operations for years. He researched everything, I said, more to myself than to the others. Location options, legal structures, tax implications. I looked up at Henderson. "Did you help him with this?" "Your grandfather was quite thorough," Henderson replied diplomatically. "He spent considerable time ensuring the foundation would be both legally sound and financially sustainable." My mother stood and walked to the window, her reflection ghost-like in the rain-streaked glass. "We thought he was getting senile," she said quietly. "All those questions about your gallery, about which artists you were showing, we thought he was just humoring you. But he hadn't been humoring me. He'd been studying my work, understanding my vision, preparing to give me the tools to make it real on a scale I'd never dared imagine. While my parents had been waiting for him to die so they could inherit his money, he'd been planning how to use that money to amplify everything they'd tried to diminish in me. "The foundation proposal includes a board structure," I said, reading further into the document. "It suggests including other gallery owners, art educators, and—" I paused, looking up at my parents, "and family members who demonstrate a commitment to the foundation's mission." The olive branch was there, embedded in legal language but unmistakable. Even in his final act of vindication, grandfather had left room for reconciliation. My parents could be part of this new world he'd created, but only if they chose to understand it rather than simply inherit it. My father moved away from the window, his footsteps heavy on the Persian rug. "We made mistakes," he said finally. "We saw what we expected to see, valued what we thought mattered." He looked at me directly for the first time since the reading began. "I don't understand art the way you do, David. I never have. But I'm beginning to understand that my failure to see value doesn't mean the value isn't there." It was perhaps the closest thing to an apology I'd ever heard from him. Not perfect, not complete, but real in a way that felt like the beginning of something rather than the end. Henderson began packing the documents back into his folder, the rustle of papers marking the transition from revelation to reality. "There are some immediate steps we'll need to take," he said. "Insurance adjustments, security consultations, and if you decide to move forward with the foundation, incorporation paperwork." The rain had stopped completely now, leaving only the sound of water dripping from the eaves and the distant hum of traffic returning to normal patterns. Through the window I could see people emerging from doorways and awnings, resuming their interrupted journeys. "Mr. Henderson," I said, "how long did my grandfather spend planning this?" The lawyer paused in his packing, considering the question. "The first draft of his will was written 3 years ago," he said, "but he revised it 17 times. The final version was completed just 2 weeks before his death. 17 revisions, each one probably adjusting some detail, refining some aspect of his plan, ensuring that every word would land with maximum impact. He'd been conducting an orchestra from beyond the grave, timing each revelation for maximum emotional effect." My mother returned to her chair, her composure somewhat restored, but her eyes still bright with unshed tears. "What happens now?" she asked. It was a simple question with complex implications. What happened to our family relationships? What happened to the gallery? What happened to the careful distance I'd maintained from their world of expectations and disappointments? "Now," I said, closing the foundation proposal and setting it carefully on the table, "I think we all have some decisions to make." The afternoon light was growing stronger, casting the office in warm gold that reminded me of the sunroom where grandfather and I had spent so many hours. I could almost hear his voice, patient and encouraging, reminding me that the most important choices were often the most difficult ones. Outside, the city was returning to life after the storm, and inside this mahogany-paneled room, 3 people who had shared a lifetime of misunderstandings were beginning to glimpse the possibility of something different. Not perfect, perhaps, but honest in a way we'd never managed before. The inheritance was more than money or art or real estate. It was an opportunity to rebuild relationships on a foundation of mutual respect rather than assumed obligations. Whether we would take that opportunity remained to be seen, but for the first time in years, it felt possible. Henderson snapped his briefcase closed, the sound sharp and final in the quiet room. "I'll be in touch within the week about the insurance and security arrangements," he said. "And David, when you're ready to discuss the foundation, I have some colleagues who specialize in nonprofit law." As we prepared to leave, I realized that grandfather's final gift wasn't just the means to expand my work. It was the chance to prove that his faith in me had been justified, not just to my parents, but to myself. The mahogany table that had seemed like a battlefield when we arrived now looked different, less like a site of conflict and more like a place where truth had finally been spoken. The rain-washed windows reflected our three figures as we gathered our things, distorted and wavering, but unmistakably together in this moment of reckoning. The elevator descended in silence, each floor marked by a soft chime that seemed unnaturally loud in the confined space. My parents stood on opposite sides of the small compartment, as if the revelations upstairs had created a physical distance between us that hadn't existed an hour before. My mother clutched her purse with white knuckles, while my father stared at the brass buttons as if they held answers to questions he was only beginning to formulate. When the doors opened onto the marble lobby, the sound of the city rushed in, car horns, footsteps, the general hum of life continuing despite the seismic shift that had just occurred in our family's understanding of itself. The storm had passed completely, leaving the streets washed clean and gleaming under afternoon sunlight that seemed almost aggressive in its brightness. We stepped onto the sidewalk together, an awkward cluster of people who shared blood and history but had never learned to share understanding. The building behind us rose into the clear sky like a monument to all the legal documents and family dramas it had witnessed over the decades. "David," my mother said, her voice tentative in a way I hadn't heard since childhood. Would you like to come to dinner tonight? We could talk about all of this." The invitation hung between us like a bridge neither of us was sure could bear weight. How many years had passed since they'd asked me to dinner without an ulterior motive? How many conversations had we avoided because they inevitably led to the same tired arguments about responsibility and practicality? "I need some time to process this," I said, which was true but also a deflection. The truth was that I needed to see the paintings again, to understand what I'd inherited not just in monetary terms but in emotional ones. Those pieces had been hanging in grandfather's house for years, part of the landscape of my childhood summers, and now they carried the weight of his final message. My father cleared his throat, a sound I recognized as his preparation for difficult conversations. "The house," he said, "your grandfather's house. We'll need to coordinate about moving the paintings, about your access to them." It was a practical concern wrapped in an attempt at consideration. The paintings were legally mine, but they were currently hanging in a house that now belonged to my parents. Another layer of complexity in an already complicated situation. "I'd like to see them again before we make any decisions about moving them," I said, to understand what he saw in them, what he wanted me to see. My mother nodded, perhaps understanding that this wasn't just about logistics but about closure, about the final conversation with grandfather that these paintings represented. "Of course, anytime. The house is, well, it's still his house, isn't it? Even though..." She didn't finish the sentence, but we all understood. The legal ownership had transferred, but the emotional ownership remained murky. How do you inherit a house full of memories that belong to someone else? A taxi pulled up to the curb and my father raised his hand automatically before seeming to remember that we hadn't discussed our separate departures. "Are you taking the train back?" he asked. "I think I'll walk for a while," I said. "Clear my head." They exchanged one of their looks, the kind that had once excluded me but now seemed more like a shared acknowledgement of their own confusion. They were as lost in this new reality as I was, perhaps more so because their assumptions about the future had been more concrete than mine. "David," my father said as they climbed into the taxi, "your grandfather, he was a complicated man, but he loved you. We all love you." The words came out awkward and unpracticed, as if he were speaking a foreign language, but they were real, and that was something. The taxi pulled away, leaving me alone on the sidewalk with the weight of the afternoon's revelations settling around me like a new coat that didn't quite fit yet. I began walking north, toward the park, letting my feet find their own rhythm while my mind tried to process what had just happened. The city moved around me in its usual patterns. People rushing to appointments, vendors calling out their wares, the eternal dance of urban life that continued regardless of individual upheavals. But as I walked, I began to notice things I might have missed before. A street musician playing violin with a case open for donations, his music floating above the traffic noise like a prayer. A small gallery tucked between a deli and a dry cleaner, its windows displaying the work of artists whose names I didn't recognize but whose vision was unmistakably personal and urgent. These were the people Grandfather's Foundation could help. Not the established artists whose work already hung in museums, but the ones still fighting for recognition, still believing that their vision mattered, despite a world that often seemed indifferent to anything that couldn't be easily monetized. I pulled out my phone and called Sarah, my wife, who would be at her own gallery across town, probably wondering how the will reading had gone. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and familiar in a way that grounded me in the present moment. "How did it go?" she asked, and I could hear the concern beneath the casual question. She'd been worried about this day, about how my parents might use the inheritance as another weapon in their long campaign to reshape me into someone more acceptable to their vision of success. "It's complicated," I said, which was perhaps the understatement of the year. "Can you meet me at Grandfather's house? There are some things I need to see, and I think I need you there when I see them." "Of course," she said without hesitation. "David, are you okay?" Was I okay? I was wealthy in ways I'd never imagined, validated in ways I'd never dared hope for, and completely uncertain about what any of it meant for the life Sarah and I had built together. Our small apartment, our modest gallery, our careful budget, all of that would change now, and change in ways that felt both exciting and terrifying. "I think so," I said, "but ask me again tomorrow." The park spread out before me, green and peaceful in the post-storm light. Families were emerging from the shelter of pavilions and covered areas, children running toward playgrounds with the particular joy that comes after being cooped up. The world was returning to normal, but my world had shifted on its axis in ways I was only beginning to understand. I thought about Grandfather's letter, about his observation that I'd never fought for money because I'd never understood that money was what they were fighting for. He'd been right, of course. I'd always seen my parents' concern about my career choices as disappointment in me personally, when perhaps it had been fear about my financial security. But he'd also given me something more valuable than financial security. He'd given me proof that someone had been watching, had seen the value in choices that seemed impractical to others. For years, I'd wondered if I was deluding myself, if my commitment to art over profit was just elaborate self-justification for failure to achieve conventional success. Now I knew that at least one person had understood. One person had seen my small gallery and my struggling artists and my modest life and had thought, "This is worth investing in. This is worth preserving and expanding." The weight of that validation was almost overwhelming, not because it changed who I was, but because it confirmed who I'd always hoped I might be. As I reached the park's entrance, I realized that the real inheritance wasn't the money, or the paintings, or even the foundation proposal. It was permission. Permission to believe that my choices had been right all along. Permission to dream bigger than I'd ever dared. Permission to build something that would outlast my own small life. The afternoon sun was warm on my face as I turned toward Grandfather's house, toward the paintings that had been waiting all these years to reveal their secrets, toward a future that suddenly seemed vast with possibility. The key turned in the familiar lock with the same soft click I remembered from childhood visits, but everything felt different now. The house that had been Grandfather's sanctuary for 40 years was now legally my parents' property, yet emotionally it remained suspended between past and future, belonging fully to neither. I stepped into the foyer, breathing in the scent that was uniquely his. Old books, linseed oil from his painting supplies, and the faint trace of the pipe tobacco he'd given up years ago, but whose ghost still lingered in the fabric of the place. Sarah's car pulled into the driveway behind me, her footsteps quick on the stone walkway as she hurried to catch up. "David?" she called, her voice echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged entryway. "What exactly are we looking for?" "Truth," I said, which sounded more dramatic than I'd intended. "I need to see the paintings again, but really see them this time. Understand what Grandfather saw when he looked at them." We moved through the house slowly, our footsteps muffled by the Persian rugs that had been here for as long as I could remember. The afternoon light streamed through tall windows, casting the familiar rooms in golden relief. Nothing had changed since the funeral 2 weeks ago, yet everything felt transformed by the knowledge of what these walls contained. The Monet was in the study, hanging beside the window where grandfather used to read his morning paper. I'd passed it hundreds of times, noting it as a pleasant sketch of water lilies, assuming it was one of the many reproductions that filled the house. Now I stood before it with new eyes, searching for the details that marked it as authentic. "Look at the brushstrokes," Sarah said softly, moving closer to examine the surface. As a gallery owner herself, she had an eye for these things. "See how they're not quite finished? That's not how reproductions are made. This has the spontaneity of plein air work." She was right. The sketch had an immediacy that suggested it had been painted outdoors, quickly, capturing a moment of light on water that would never come again. It was a fragment of time made permanent, worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. "He must have known I'd walk past this every day," I said. "All those summers when I was learning to paint, when we'd sit in here and talk about light and composition. He was teaching me to see, and this was part of the lesson." We moved to the hallway, where the Picasso drawing hung in a simple frame that did nothing to announce its significance. It was barely larger than a sheet of notebook paper, a few confident lines that suggested rather than described the female form. I'd always admired its economy, the way Picasso could capture so much with so little. "Preparatory sketch for Les Demoiselles d'Avignon," Sarah read from the authentication papers I'd brought from the lawyer's office. "My God, David, this is like finding the rough draft of a masterpiece." But it was more than that. It was evidence of process, of the way great art emerged from experimentation and revision. Grandfather had been showing me that even masters began with simple sketches, that the path to greatness was built from small, careful steps. The hopper was in the sunroom, hanging above the fireplace where grandfather and I had spent countless hours. This was the room where I'd learned to really look at paintings, where he'd taught me that art was not decoration, but a window into human experience. The landscape showed a house at twilight, isolated and somehow melancholy despite its beauty. "I always loved this one," I said, settling into grandfather's chair. "There's something about the loneliness in it that felt honest." Sarah studied the painting with professional attention. "Early Hopper," she mused, "before he developed that stark, geometric style he's known for. But you can see it emerging. The way he uses light to create mood, the sense of isolation even in a beautiful setting." I thought about all the times grandfather and I had sat in this room, him in this chair, me at the easel he'd set up by the window. He'd never directly criticized my work, but he'd guide my attention to details, the way shadows fell across a surface, how color could suggest emotion, why negative space was as important as the painted areas. He was preparing me, I said, the realization settling over me like recognition of something I'd always known but never articulated. Not just teaching me to paint, but teaching me to understand value that isn't obvious, teaching me to see what others miss. Sarah sat on the arm of the chair, her hand resting on my shoulder. "He was teaching you to trust your own vision," she said, "even when other people couldn't see what you saw." The afternoon light was beginning to shift, casting longer shadows across the room. Soon my parents would return from whatever conversations they were having about this new reality, and we'd need to make practical decisions about insurance and security and the future of these pieces. But for now, I wanted to sit in grandfather's chair and understand the final gift he'd given me. Not just the financial means to expand my work, but validation that the work itself had been worthwhile all along. "The foundation proposal," I said, pulling out the document Henderson had given me. "He outlines exhibition space for emerging artists, grants for art education programs, partnerships with schools that have cut their arts funding." Sarah leaned over to read with me, her finger tracing the detailed financial projections. "He researched everything," she said. "Location costs, staffing requirements, even potential board members. David, this isn't just a proposal. It's a complete business plan." I flipped through the pages, seeing grandfather's vision unfold in careful detail. He'd identified specific artists whose work deserved wider recognition, schools where children were being denied access to arts education, communities where a gallery presence could make a real difference. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to a section near the end. "He's outlined a partnership program with existing galleries and including ours. He wanted to create a network, not competition." The generosity of the vision was overwhelming. Even in death, grandfather was thinking about collaboration. about lifting up the entire arts community rather than just advancing his own legacy. He'd understood that art flourished in ecosystems, not isolation. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Your father and I would like to come by this evening if that's all right. We have some things we'd like to discuss." I showed the message to Sarah, who nodded. "They're trying," she said. "That's something." It was something. Not everything. Not a complete transformation of decades of misunderstanding, but a beginning. The inheritance had shifted the power dynamic in our family, but more importantly, it had forced all of us to examine assumptions we'd held for years. "What do you think grandfather would say if he were here now?" I asked. Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering. "I think he'd say that the hard work is just beginning, that inheriting the means to make a difference is only the first step. The real test is what you do with it." She was right, of course. The paintings and the money and the foundation proposal were tools, not destinations. Grandfather had given me the resources to build something meaningful, but the building itself would be up to me. The sunroom was growing dim as evening approached, the Hopper landscape taking on deeper shadows that seemed to echo the twilight outside. I thought about all the decisions that lay ahead. Which pieces to sell to fund the foundation, where to locate the new space, how to structure the board to ensure the mission remained pure. But underneath all the practical concerns was a deeper question. Was I worthy of the faith grandfather had placed in me? Could I build something that would honor not just his memory, but the vision he'd spent years carefully nurturing? The answer would come in time, through work and dedication, and the daily choices that would shape whatever emerged from this moment. For now, it was enough to sit in his chair, surrounded by the art he'd chosen so carefully, and feel the weight of possibility settling around me like a mantle I was only beginning to learn how to wear. Outside, the first streetlights were beginning to flicker on, marking the transition from day to evening, from revelation to responsibility. The inheritance was no longer a surprise, but a commitment, and tomorrow the real work would begin. The sound of my parents' car in the driveway broke the contemplative silence that had settled over the sunroom. Sarah and I exchanged a look, the kind of wordless communication that comes from years of marriage, an acknowledgement that whatever happened next would require careful navigation of emotional terrain that had been reshaping itself all day. Through the window, I watched them approach the front door with hesitant steps, as if they were visiting strangers rather than entering a house they now legally owned. My father carried a bottle of wine, an expensive vintage I recognized from his collection, the kind he usually reserved for important business dinners. My mother had changed from her formal will-reading attire into something softer, more approachable. "David?" my mother called as they entered, her voice carrying a tentative quality I hadn't heard in years. "Are you still here?" "In the sunroom," I replied, standing to meet them. The Hopper landscape caught the last rays of sunlight, its painted twilight merging with the actual evening settling over the house. They appeared in the doorway together, and for a moment we all simply stood there. Four people who had shared decades of history but were meeting each other, as if for the first time. The inheritance had stripped away the familiar roles we'd played. The disappointed parents, the rebellious son, the wife who tried to keep peace, leaving us to discover who we might be without those comfortable scripts. "We brought dinner," my father said, holding up a bag from the Italian restaurant grandfather had favored. "Thought we might talk, if you're willing." The gesture was small, but significant. They had come not as owners claiming their property, but as family members seeking connection. The wine, the food, the careful tone, all of it suggested an effort to begin again on different terms. "Of course," Sarah said when I hesitated. "Let me help you set up in the dining room." As we moved through the familiar ritual of laying out plates and opening wine, I found myself noticing details I'd overlooked before. The way my mother's hands shook slightly as she arranged the napkins, how my father kept glancing at the paintings on the walls, as if seeing them for the first time, the careful space they maintained around me, as if I had become fragile or dangerous in some way they didn't quite understand. "The Monet," my mother said finally, as we settled around the mahogany table where grandfather had hosted countless family dinners. I walked past it every time I visited. How could I not have known? It was a question that contained multitudes, not just about artistic authentication, but about the nature of seeing itself. How many times had she looked without truly observing? How many conversations with grandfather had she participated in without really listening? He never told us, my father added, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been hurt. All those years, all those visits, and he never mentioned their value. Would it have mattered? I asked, the question emerging before I could consider its implications. If you'd known they were valuable, would you have seen them differently? The silence that followed was answer enough. Of course they would have seen them differently. They would have insisted on better security, proper insurance, climate control. They would have treated them as investments rather than art, which was perhaps exactly why grandfather had kept their true nature secret. That's not fair, my mother said quietly. We're not monsters, David. We would have appreciated their significance. But would you have appreciated their beauty? Sarah asked, her voice gentle but pointed. Would you have sat with them the way David did, trying to understand what the artist was feeling when they created them? It was the heart of the matter, really. The difference between valuing something for what it could provide versus valuing it for what it was. Grandfather had understood this distinction and had structured his final lesson accordingly. My father poured wine with careful precision, the ritual giving him time to formulate his thoughts. Your grandfather was a teacher, he said finally, even at the end. Especially at the end. He wanted us to learn something. What do you think he wanted us to learn? I asked. That we were wrong, my mother said, her voice barely above a whisper. About you, about what matters, about the choices you made. She looked up from her plate, meeting my eyes directly. We thought we were protecting you from disappointment. We thought practical success was the only kind that mattered. The admission hung in the air like smoke from grandfather's old pipe, visible and substantial. It wasn't a complete apology. There were too many years of accumulated hurt for that. But it was acknowledgement, which was perhaps more valuable. The foundation proposal, my father said, changing the subject to safer ground. We read through it while we were processing everything. It's impressive, comprehensive. You read it? I asked, surprised. Henderson gave us a copy, my mother explained. He said grandfather wanted us to understand the full scope of what he was planning. She paused, choosing her words carefully. David, the board structure he outlined, it includes positions for family members. I nodded, remembering that detail from my earlier reading. If they demonstrate commitment to the mission, I said, quoting grandfather's exact language. What would that look like? My father asked. Demonstrating commitment? It was a fair question and one I hadn't fully considered. How do you measure commitment to something you've never understood? How do you bridge the gap between financial support and genuine appreciation for art's value beyond monetary worth? I think, Sarah said carefully, it would mean learning to see art the way David sees it, not as decoration or investment, but as communication, as human expression that matters for its own sake. My mother nodded slowly. Your grandfather tried to teach us that, didn't he? All those times he'd point out details in paintings, try to explain what made them special. We thought he was just making conversation. He was trying to share his passion, I said, the same way I tried to share mine. The parallel was obvious once spoken. Grandfather's patient attempts to educate them about art had been no different from my own efforts to explain why I'd chosen gallery work over corporate law. Both of us had been trying to communicate the value of something that couldn't be easily quantified. The evening deepened around us, the dining room taking on the intimate quality that comes when artificial light replaces natural illumination. My father refilled our wine glasses, the gesture automatic but somehow ceremonial, as if he were marking the transition from one kind of conversation to another. There's something we need to discuss, my mother said, her voice taking on a more formal tone. About the house, about the paintings, about how we move forward from here. I felt Sarah tense beside me. This was the practical conversation we'd been avoiding, the one about logistics and ownership and the complicated reality of valuable art hanging in a house that now belonged to people who had never understood its significance. The insurance alone will be substantial, my father said. Security systems, climate control, proper storage if the pieces need to be moved. We're not equipped to handle that level of responsibility. It was a reasonable concern, but something in his tone suggested this was leading somewhere specific. My mother was watching me carefully, as if gauging my reaction to words not yet spoken. We've been thinking, my mother continued, about what your grandfather really wanted. Not just the legal distribution of assets, but the spirit behind his decisions. She paused, choosing her words with the care of someone walking across thin ice. He wanted you to have the means to build something meaningful, But he also wanted us to understand what we'd been missing all these years. "What are you saying?" I asked, though I was beginning to sense the direction of their thoughts. "We're saying," my father replied, "that maybe the best way to honor his intentions is to work together, not as separate parties dividing up an inheritance, but as family members building something he would have been proud of." The proposal hung in the air between us, revolutionary in its simplicity. Instead of the traditional division of assets and responsibilities, they were suggesting collaboration. It was either the most generous offer I'd ever received from them, or the most sophisticated manipulation. "What would that look like?" Sarah asked, her gallery owner's instincts engaging with the practical implications. "The house becomes the foundation headquarters," my mother said. "The paintings remain here, properly secured and insured, but as part of a living institution rather than a private collection. We contribute the property and ongoing operational support. You contribute your expertise and vision." It was elegant in its logic, but I found myself searching for the catch. Years of disappointment had taught me to be suspicious of offers that seemed too good to be true, especially from people who had spent decades trying to reshape me into someone more acceptable to their worldview. "And the board positions?" I asked. "We earn them," my father said simply. "Not through financial contribution, but through demonstrated understanding of what the foundation is trying to accomplish. Through learning to see art the way you see it, the way your grandfather saw it." The role reversal was complete. My parents, who had spent years trying to educate me about practical success, were asking me to educate them about something they'd never valued. It was either profound growth or elaborate theater, and I wasn't sure I could tell the difference. "This isn't a decision we need to make tonight," Sarah said diplomatically. "There are legal implications, tax considerations, a dozen practical issues that would need to be worked out." She was right, of course. The emotional appeal of the moment shouldn't override careful consideration of the complexities involved. But as I looked around the dining room where grandfather had hosted so many family gatherings, I could almost hear his voice encouraging me to consider not just the practical implications, but the human ones. "Why?" I asked finally. "Why are you willing to do this?" My mother's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back all evening. "Because we lost you," she said, "somewhere along the way. In all our concern about your future and your security, we lost sight of who you actually are. Your grandfather never lost sight of that. He saw something in you that we couldn't see," my father added, "or wouldn't see. And today, reading his letter, understanding what he'd been planning, we realized that the failure wasn't yours. It was ours. The admission was more complete than I'd expected, more vulnerable than I'd thought them capable of. It didn't erase decades of misunderstanding, but it acknowledged them in a way that felt genuine rather than strategic. "I need time to think," I said, "to talk with Sarah, to understand all the implications." "Of course," my mother said, "we're not going anywhere. For the first time in years, we have all the time in the world to get this right." As we cleared the dinner dishes, moving through the familiar choreography of a shared meal ending, I found myself thinking about grandfather's final gift. Not just the paintings or the money or the foundation proposal, but the opportunity to rebuild relationships that had seemed irreparably damaged. Whether that opportunity would lead to genuine reconciliation or simply more sophisticated disappointment remained to be seen. But for the first time in years, it felt possible that my parents and I might find a way to understand each other, to build something together that honored both their need for security and my commitment to art. The evening air was cool as we walked to our cars, the neighborhood settling into its nighttime quiet. My parents' offer hung between us like a bridge we weren't yet sure we could trust, but which represented the possibility of crossing into new territory. "Think about it," my father said as they prepared to leave. "But remember, whatever you decide, you're not alone in this anymore." As their taillights disappeared down the street, Sarah and I stood in the driveway of the house that might become the foundation's headquarters, surrounded by the weight of possibility and the fear of disappointment in equal measure. "What do you think?" she asked. "I think," I said slowly, "that grandfather would be pleased with how complicated he's made everything." She laughed, the sound carrying across the quiet neighborhood like a promise that whatever came next, we would face it together. The inheritance was no longer just about money or art or family reconciliation. It was about the courage to believe that people could change, that understanding could grow, that love could find new ways to express itself even after years of miscommunication. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and insurance agents and the practical reality of turning vision into institution, But tonight, standing in the driveway of a house full of hidden treasures, it was enough to believe that grandfather's final lesson was still unfolding, still teaching us all how to see value in places we'd never thought to look. The months that followed moved with the deliberate pace of careful construction. Sarah and I spent weeks with lawyers and insurance specialists, transforming grandfather's vision from proposal into reality. The Morrison Foundation for Emerging Artists was incorporated on a crisp October morning, exactly 6 months after the will reading that had changed everything. The house underwent renovation with the same meticulous attention grandfather had given to his art collection. Security systems were installed with museum-grade precision, climate control calibrated to protect the paintings that would anchor the foundation's permanent collection. The sunroom where grandfather and I had spent so many afternoons became the main gallery space, its northern light perfect for displaying the work of artists still fighting for recognition. My parents kept their word in ways both large and small. My father enrolled in art history courses at the local university, approaching the subject with the same methodical intensity he'd once applied to business ventures. My mother volunteered at the children's art program we established, learning to see creativity through young eyes unclouded by assumptions about practical value. The first board meeting was held on a snowy December evening, around the same mahogany table where we'd shared that tentative dinner months before. The agenda was formal, but the atmosphere was warm with the kind of purpose grandfather had always believed art could provide. The Hendricks grant application, Sarah reported, reading from her notes. Emerging sculptor, working with recycled materials. The review committee recommends full funding. My mother looked up from her own papers. I visited her studio last week, she said. The way she transforms discarded objects into something beautiful. I'm beginning to understand what you mean about art as communication. It wasn't a complete transformation. Years of different priorities don't disappear overnight. But it was progress, measured in small moments of genuine appreciation rather than dutiful support. The Foundation's first exhibition opened on a warm spring evening, exactly 1 year after grandfather's death. Local artists whose work had never been shown in formal gallery settings displayed pieces alongside established names, creating conversations across generations in styles that would have delighted him. I stood in the main gallery, watching visitors move between the paintings with the kind of careful attention grandfather had always encouraged. A young girl, perhaps 8 years old, stood transfixed before the Hopper landscape, her head tilted in concentration. "Why does it make me feel lonely?" she asked her mother. "I don't know," her mother replied, "but that's a very good question." It was exactly the kind of moment grandfather had envisioned. Art prompting questions rather than providing easy answers, creating space for wonder rather than mere appreciation. The evening's program included a brief ceremony dedicating the foundation to grandfather's memory. I'd prepared remarks, but standing before the gathered crowd of artists and supporters and family members, the formal words seemed inadequate. "My grandfather taught me that the most valuable things are often hidden in plain sight," I said instead. "That understanding requires patience, that beauty exists whether or not we're sophisticated enough to recognize it, and that the greatest gift we can give each other is the willingness to see beyond our own assumptions." The applause was warm but brief. This wasn't about celebration, but about commitment to the work ahead. As the evening wound down and guests began to drift toward the reception in the dining room, I found myself alone with the paintings that had started it all. The Monet sketch caught the gallery lighting with the same immediacy it must have possessed when first painted. The Picasso drawing suggested infinite possibilities with its few confident lines. The Hopper landscape held its melancholy beauty like a secret waiting to be discovered. But they were no longer just valuable objects or even family heirlooms. They had become teachers, continuing grandfather's work of showing people how to see, how to value what couldn't be easily quantified, how to find meaning in the space between question and answer. Sarah appeared beside me, her hand finding mine with familiar comfort. "He would have loved this," she said, gesturing toward the reception where my parents were deep in conversation with a young painter about the relationship between color and emotion. "He did love this," I replied. "He just had to wait for the rest of us to catch up." The foundation would grow in the years to come, supporting hundreds of artists, educating thousands of children, proving that investment in beauty and truth could yield returns that no financial portfolio could match. But its real success was measured in moments like this, when people learned to see value in places they'd never thought to look. As the last guests departed, and we began the familiar ritual of closing the gallery for the night, I realized that grandfather's final gift hadn't been the paintings or the money or even the foundation itself. It had been the demonstration that understanding could grow, that relationships could heal, that love could find new expressions even after years of miscommunication. The house settled into its nighttime quiet, but it was no longer the silence of isolation. It was the peaceful pause between one day's work and the next, the breath between movements in a symphony that would continue long after any of us were there to conduct it. I turned off the gallery lights and locked the door, leaving the paintings to their vigil in the darkness. Tomorrow would bring new applications to review, new artists to support, new opportunities to prove that grandfather's faith in the power of art to transform lives had been justified. But tonight, walking through the house where I'd learned to see beauty in unexpected places, it was enough to know that his voice would continue speaking through the work we'd built together, teaching future generations what he'd spent a lifetime trying to show us, that the most valuable inheritance isn't what we receive but what we choose to give.